Hello everyone and welcome to the third session of the ISC Research 2024 Annual Conference, Supporting Students with AI. I'm India Cannon from ISC Research. I'm the Social Media and Events Assistant and I'll be moderating the session today. Before I pass you on to our first speaker, there are a couple of housekeeping elements to mention. Firstly, if you have any questions, please use the Q&A box at the bottom. If we're unable to get to your question, we'll be answering as many as possible in the AI panel session, which is at 1 p.m. UK time, and that'll be in the same Zoom link as you're currently in. Alternatively, we do have a discussion thread for day one of this conference, which will be in the area of interest. If you're keen to carry on the conversation, then please head over there after the discussion. If you have any technical difficulties, please log off and log back on. This usually fixes the problem. If it doesn't work, then please let me know in the QA box and I'll help you out. And finally, we are recording this webinar today, so we'll be uploading the recording to the annual conference area of interest here on the ISC community. So without any further ado, I'd like to welcome Rebecca Mace, Senior Lecturer in Education at the University of West London. Thank you.
I share my slides. Hi, everybody. And there we go. Can you see my slides? Is that working with SlideShare? Sorry, I can't.
It's not on your slides, it's on, I think it's your document.
Okay. Sorry, the children are tech, that's what they say, isn't it? Microsoft Slides, share. Does that work now? Is that my slides? Is that on my slides now? Yeah. SlideShare. Say from start. That's sharing my slides now. Yeah, cool. Okay, sorry about that. Right. So hi, I'm Rebecca Mace. Thank you very much for having me. I'm here to talk to you with the title of The Dangers of Gen AI, Safeguarding Plagiarism and its Inaccuracies. And I'll go into some of those as we go through a bit more in detail. But I'm a senior lecturer in education. I'm first and foremost a philosopher with a keen interest in the way that technology impacts upon human experience and the way that we are showing up in the world and how that's changing with the more technological interventions that we're having in our world. I teach on BA and MA education courses at both UCL, University of Worcester, and I was previously at the University of West London, but I've literally just moved. But before I went into higher ed, I was a senior school philosophy and religious studies teacher. I was a head of department, a residential tutor, and I took sports teams. I had a third form netball team and the reluctant Saturday non-fixture sports group. I'm telling you these things because I want to reiterate that I'm very much one of you. I'm not here to tell you what's right for your school or how to do it. I'm a really big advocate of teacher agency. So you know your schools, you know your pupils, and you know the rest of your management. So please feel free to use, abuse, or ignore everything that I've got to say. I'm not going to try and convince you of a particular point of view. I'm just going to try and present you with some things that may add to or start a discussion in your school about the topics. I'm going to be presenting multiple sides of the argument, and I want you to be open to all of them, because I think that's the only way that we can teach criticality, is by embodying it, is by turning arguments around and looking at them from all different directions. My doctorate looked at the way that social media changes the way that we explore age-old questions. So I considered how our relationship with truth and reality has shifted. What does it mean to know thyself in a technological age? And this is particularly important because we're presented frequently with this message that technology knows us better than we know ourselves, that technology can offer us more than we can have a sense of in terms of who we are. And so considering similar issues in this Gen AI space seems like a natural progression. So alongside my role as a lecturer of education, I've worked with EdTech and AI ed industry now for 6 or 7 years. helping to develop AI augmented learning, teaching and marking tools for teachers and students. And I've got a particular focus in widening participation through equity in education. Now, technology is firmly embedded in our ways of being, and Gen AI is set to do the same. But I don't know, I doubt you'll have watched, but if you get the opportunity to, I highly recommend it. It's John Burge's 1972 series, which is on YouTube, Ways of Seeing. It's a BBC series, and it's about art. But in it, he presents this idea that the relationship between what we see and what we know is never really settled. And the way that we see things is affected by what we know and what we believe. This is how a picture looks, he says, but it doesn't have to be. And so I want to use that lens today to look at the ways we see our interactions with technology. So more often than not, AI seems to be something that's framed as a good or an evil. Your educational management may approach it either by adopting a deficit model within your school, that AI has to be integrated in some way, that education is somehow lacking without AI involved. Or you might find yourself in a school, or you may lead a school, in which AI is banned. You might treat it as entirely negative, where people are cheating if they're using it. In which case you've got every right. If people are cheating, you've got every right to be resistant to its use. Indeed, both these positions offer a way of seeing, but it doesn't have to be one or the other. And we need to start reframing our approaches towards the use of Gen AI in order for us to step away from this binary, in order to promote proper and true criticality within our students and within our schools. One way you can do this is start looking at your own uses, your own ways of behaviour. And if you're anything like me, there's going to be points in your day when you check your phone and you put it down and you have no idea what you've looked at. You don't know whether it was time you were looking at or whether it was a text message that had come and you have no recollection. It was just a mindless reaction that you did it. Now, this mindless reaction is often presented as a bad thing. It might look that way, but it doesn't have to. And perhaps we could reframe something about this mindless reaction to make it look different. So some of my colleagues are currently researching the way that young people on the autistic spectrum, use a scrolling action, whether that's through social media, TikTok, or just the internet at large, as a positive self-soothing technique. So it's a way around their overstimulation in the real world. So it looks like mindless scrolling can look like one thing, but it might actually be the opposite. It could be a negative, but it could be a positive. But the important thing to remember in all of this is it doesn't have to be settled or definitively one thing or the other. Sometimes it can be both. And it's having an awareness of this simultaneity that I want to really hold on to throughout the talk today, throughout the rest of what I've got to say, because that's the space that I think we need to inhabit more readily when we're talking about AI in education. So today the title is Dangers of, but I really do want to think about both sides of the coin regarding plagiarism, safeguarding, and the inaccuracies that can be produced. So I'm going to touch on both pastoral and educational and academic aspects, because they come together. They always have come together. We know that the pastoral is no separate from the academic aspects within our school, and I think the same applies to Gen AI. So let's look at relationships. First of all, I will touch on the academic uses, but I think it's really important to note the personal and social uses to start with, because they do play this integral role to your entire student experience. Your approaches to learning are impacted by everything else that goes on in your life. So within educational spaces, our interactions with tech have and always will go way beyond any academic application. So they don't need to be treated as distinct educational and pastoral uses. And you can see this with ChatGPT or OpenAI when it first happened. So there was much furore in the press about ChatGPT being the end of exams. This is going to be the point where students cheat from now on. But if you look at what students were doing, what pupils in schools were doing with OpenAI, it was on Snapchat. They were interacting with it as their Snapchat friend. They were not speaking to it about their exams and revision initially. Some of them did, some of them moved on to that space, but initially they were looking at it and interacting with it about very different issues to what the rest of the world was talking about. Now, we've all seen headlines about people falling in love with chatbots, about people falling in love and having friendships with their AIs. There's as a whole, I love having rows with chatbots. I have done for several years. And particularly bank ones, they irritate me the most. But we have this kind of relationship. We treat AIs as if they're people. And so I think it's, instead of this academic focus, it's worth just spending a moment looking at the personal or pastoral purpose that Gen AIs have. And because we want to have a human relationship with them, we've interacted with them right from the start as if they are people. We anthropomorphize them. Now, that's not new. Anthropomorphizing tech is not a new thing. We've always done it. We've shouted at computers for years. We have this, though it stopped speaking to the printer kind of language. We've named our cars. We've talked to the toaster. But we like to ascribe personalities to our technology. My department, we've all named our AIs and we talk about them. I'll get Alan to do that, or get George to ask Garrick. At one point, we've even discussed whether they should feature in the minutes of a meeting because they had played such an integral role. Over the years, I've been asked by younger children whether all the series know each other. And there's a multitude of Instagram reels and memes where the various Gen AIs or chatbots kind of have some sort of shared office space where they all know each other and they're dealing like in a call center with incoming calls and requests. And this is where the line gets really blurred, because although we know in our mind, like completely logically, we know they don't have feelings in their systems, we still behave towards them as if they do. For example, I was sat with a group of teenagers not that long ago who were having a really animated discussion about whether ChatGPT gives you better answers if you say please at the end. One was adamant that their ChatGPT did, and the others were not really so convinced. So there's lots of ways in which we speak to these tools as if they're people. Now, there's some positive examples of why that can result in some really good outcomes. If we go to look at some research being done by the University of Cincinnati, they've looked at the mental and social health benefits of using chatbots and communication technologies to provide mental health support. The results are largely positive. It says that chatbots can aid lessen feelings of depression, anxiety, stress. I mean, it's really important to note that they haven't been around for very long. So, you know, the longer term outcomes of this are unknown at the moment. And the ones that they were using were quite limited in what they could do. And they still do get a lot of things wrong. And we must also bear in mind that those who don't have the AI literacy to understand the limitations of these systems will ultimately pay the price. But that's where we come in as educators. Now, it's really important to note as well that frequently, every day, Gen AI, whether that's chat, Bard, whichever platform people are on, they're frequently asked for relationship advice. So in terms of our roles as safeguarding contacts within schools, we need to be slightly aware of what's going on there. Now, one teenager I know set up a chorus of voices. They've got a sort of a chat group basically of people that they like to talk to about their latest antics. In their mind, there's nothing odd about doing that. It's there, so why not? There's a platform called Character AI, which you might be aware of, in which users will create interactive stories or engage in role plays that they might otherwise be too embarrassed to do with their real friend or real life friends. So they can explore aspects of who they are in that space. Some say that it helps them actually improve their social skills because one reported and said that, oh, I'm a bit of a pushover in real life, but I can practice being assertive and I can practice putting across my opinions in the AI space, on this Character AI space, without embarrassing myself. So it's become this safe space in which they can do that. Now you can see how that's quite a positive one way of looking at things. And then we have a kind of continuum where we start moving across to some of the more negative aspects. Now, there's some positive aspects to exploring relationships. So there's also the other side of that. So there's an extensive genre of sexualized bots which exist on this Character AI site, but there are others. And there's a sort of an online running joke about the fear of your parents finding these chats or the fear of your teachers finding these chats. So these relationship bots, there's sort of a typical genres of them. One is billionaire boyfriend, who is apparently very fond of whisking his users away to a private island. And then apparently there is which is fine for a while, but then often the kind of responses that are coming back, the responses generated are so dirty that the Character AI system will block them. So that's something else to be aware of, is the kind of conversations that maybe young people are being exposed to. And another very popular bot on this character AI site is the ex-girlfriend bot called Olivia, who is apparently specifically designed to be rude and cruel, but at the same time secretly pining for whoever she's chatting to. Now, what's interesting is she's logged nearly 38 million interactions. So she's clearly providing a need for some people. She's meeting that need. Now, that's not necessarily a bad thing that young people are exploring this. They're sort of role playing, they're rehearsing. What does this feel like? What does this look like? They're seeing how they show up in those situations. How would they respond? But you can see how it could tip over into something that maybe isn't necessarily the most positive of space. It is worth bearing in mind that people have always had sort of pop star fantasies, or there's been the chat rooms of the early 90s where these sorts of conversations were also happening. This is not new behavior online, it's just being done in a different space. So it does mimic the internet behavior of previous generations. And you could argue that sort of a lot of that hasn't actually damaged anyone. People have come out kind of okay from that at the end. It's not ruined society, and that's reassuring. I mean, that's great. But as educators, it is our duty to put ourselves in the way of and specifically seek out the aspects and the moments when it's not okay, when there are things which are kind of going awry. And so there are huge safeguarding issues that we need to be aware of that happen within these contexts. So one of which is unchecked views that are getting produced from the Gen AI. There's others about unequal representation and stereotyping. Now, in 2021, Replica, who is another chat bot kind of that has girlfriends and boyfriends that it can provide you with, a 21-year-old tried to murder the late Queen as a result of his chatbot girlfriend encouraging him in his delusions. He'd outlined this plan. He said, should he talk it all through? Should I do this? Should I not do this? And her response was basically, yeah, that seems completely logical. Go for it. Do it. Because it was completely logical. It was a totally logical plan. It was completely logical within its own confines. But she, as an AI, was looking for the logic, was not looking for the moral code. There was no moral compass in there. There was no ethical or emotional understanding. So that's something to be aware of. Other things to be aware of from a safeguarding perspective: text to audio models, they're going to grow more prevalent. And their use in fraud, misinformation, and risky contexts are also going to grow. So already being used in voice cloning, which we've seen over in the American elections with some voice cloning, with some phone calls that were made, this type of abuse is going to become more prominent in other areas of abuse as well. So hate speech, disinformation, individuals' voices being cloned so that they can falsely claim that someone said something that they haven't said in order to achieve malicious aims. This could be used on a national level, but it can also be used on a more local level. It can be used in your school by young people against one another and also against you. Your voice could be cloned. It could be them bullying each other. The same applies to image generation. Images can be really easily manipulated now. People can be put in situations and places that they've never been, nor would they ever put themselves in. So we need to be aware of those. On top of this, Gen AI tools to create sexually explicit content continues to grow. So using these things from sort of organised crime groups as well as from just everyday users. If you couple that with the rise of the sextortion crimes and the rise of sort of ease of access to Gen AI, there's this explosion basically in nude image creation. So the dark web chat about creating non-consensual intimate images of women increased by 360% last year alone. And child sexual abuse material that was produced by Gen AI increased by 335% last year across the dark web predator communities. So that's just in that one little section of the dark web that people have been able to identify. So these are massively concerning things, and they are at the extreme end. And it would be remiss of me not to tell you about them and not to take them very seriously in your schools. You need to be aware that there's this sort of very extreme end, and then there's also the fine end. There's the kids that won't go anywhere near any of that stuff and won't be touched by that more negative aspect of things. And so it's a case of holding those two in mind. It's never going to be all one or all the other. They're always going to coexist. But what you can do for both groups is to be aware from your school's position, from your school's perspective, is make sure that they are aware and you are aware of this unregulated advice that's coming from any chatbots or Gen AIs that they're interacting with. Your school internet filters won't pick up the alert words because it will be contained within the ChatGPT or whichever one they're using. If they're typing advice for suicide, for example, your school filter won't pick that up. There's specific values which are embedded within the training data because of where it's been trained from. They may not align with your school's values. They may not align with the parents of your school's values. It's worth bearing that in mind and holding on to those sorts of things. It's also worth highlighting that the responses it will generate are based on logic, as I've said, and not emotion. So those are the sorts of things you need to have in your minds at all points when you're dealing with these issues. Another really important thing that came out of a lot of research from two different research projects that I did last year. One was with GoodNotes and one was with UCL, which was a mini pilot I'm going to tell you about later, that the kids themselves, when they were asked, what is it that concerns you most about AI in the future? And the top thing that came out in 2 independent studies was learned helplessness. They're all really worried that they're kind of being sleepwalking into this tech knows best, tech can be better than us, and that they're just learning. It's the kind of Wall-E type experience that they're learning this complete helplessness, that they are unable to express their own opinions and views. So the young people that we work with spoke about their friends. It was never them, it was always their friends, sort of using it to replace real engagement with topics, that they were able to produce very quickly this polished looking response. It was style over substance. It wasn't one that they worked really hard to get involved with, and they were kind of being pushed towards this tech knows best response. And we've got to listen to that. That's really key, because their concerns about learned helplessness, or enfeeblement as it's known in the literature, takes away something really important about education. So from my perspective, I've always thought that education, the whole purpose of it, the point of it, is this personal struggle to find your own thinking and get your own voice. Because finding your own voice is a whole lot more than just having something to say. And so if you're being provided with something to say, it gives you less opportunity to find your own voice with having wrestled with what that might look like. So we need to look at ways of empowering and amplifying and encouraging a critical student voice, not just letting them sleepwalk into that. And here, I think it's important to step over into academic uses, because you can empower this critical voice in the academic and then they will use it in their pastoral. So the Higher Education Policy Institute did some research that they repeated again and did in February 2024. And it looked at first-year undergrads. So these are students that are not too much older than the ones that you've got in schools. They've stepped out of school and they've come into this world of Gen AI. And 3/4 of them said that they were using or that they expected to use Gen AI in work context after they finished their degree. 53% of them said they were already using it to help them prep for their assessments, although it's generally expected that will be much higher. A lot of people won't admit to using it because they think they're going to get in trouble for academic offences. But the most common use isn't actually in assessments. The most common use, which 36% of people who said that they used it said that they used it in this way, is to use it as a personal tutor, where they'll ask, oh, tell me about this, explain this to me, tell me this in a different way. But what was really staggering is that 1/3 of those students have no idea how much it makes stuff up. They literally don't know whether it's telling them the truth or not. However, rather than focusing on that, because I'm going to come to sort of hallucinations and things that Gen AI can do later, I think there's also an interesting trend that's running parallel that we really need to also pay attention to. So an American survey, which looked at senior management and its use of AI and Gen AI, this survey seemed to suggest that senior staff, which correlated generally with those who were older and had less experience of using Gen AI and it was quite new and exciting to them, they trusted it a lot and they feared it a lot as well. Whereas the people who were in junior positions in the same companies who'd used AI a lot more were not so trusting of it. They didn't really bother too much about what it said. They also feared it a lot less too. It had become demystified. Now, this sits in line with just my general experience with having worked with teenagers over the years, that in a non-tech space, teenagers are just generally quite unimpressed. They're unimpressed with everything. Why would they be impressed with Gen AI? They've grown up in this world where they've got rapid technological development. It's normal. The gaming that they do is always way better than anything you can provide on a screen that's in an educational situation. So why would they be impressed by most of what we're talking about when we're getting worried about Gen AI? So I often find that, as another analogy, is I feel like I'm the parent who's taken their toddler to the zoo when I'm showing kids these new techs. I'm super impressed. I think this is amazing. And there's loads of rare animals and there's loads of things that I've never seen before. But to the toddler, it's basically the same as the cat at home because it's an animal. They don't know that that animal is really any different to any other animal, or why they should be more impressed by it because it's just got 4 legs or 2 legs, or it's furry or it's not. And everything, because their entire lives are filled with the new and unexpected, it's got to be seriously amazing or seriously different just to attract their attention in some way. And often that way won't be what we as an adult would consider to be as exciting. In a recent conversation about tech development, one teenager told me adults are freaking out about stuff. It's just not that deep. And I find that really refreshing. And that's why I like working with teenagers, because they make it their business to take a tech tool, use it in a way it wasn't intended, break it, and then problem solve to make it better. Because they don't need to treat them with reverence. They don't need to treat these things with this sort of, oh, wow, isn't this exciting, that we might do as adults because we haven't seen these things before. So if we come to the issue of trust, oh, let's not come to plagiarism just yet. Just coming to the issue of trust, like, why do we trust? Why, whatever level of trust that is, I think this is something that's an important conversation to have. Why do we trust adults possibly more than younger people? But to a level, the young people still will trust what they're told. They don't know if it's right or wrong, but they'll go with it. Why do we do that? So one reason is we anthropomorphize it. I've talked about that before. That's not new. Another reason is that it writes in this way that we've been primed to trust. So education, we've almost made this problem ourselves. The Gen AI produces responses that are written in a way that we kind of understand, that we will connect with. They have this objective view from nowhere. They sound as if they are not being from one perspective or another. And as a society, as a culture, we've privileged that. We've always privileged, we haven't always, but more recently, we've always privileged that. So we like this scientific approach. We like this way that sounds. It sounds like it's got no opinion. But what's interesting about this is that we do this privilege that on the one hand, but on the other hand, we've given them personalities. We're speaking to them like they're people. We don't seem to have put those two things together yet, to have appreciated that this objective perspective is deeply embedded with bias, that it's got, it has, as if it's a person, it has a bias, it's been trained on something. It may not have the human care that maybe a real person might have, but it's got all the bias, it's got all of the strange, weird and wonderful views that people have. And we don't pay attention to that when we're reading it. We just trust what it's saying. Okay, that sounds interesting, because of how it's phrased, because of how it's presented to us. So plagiarism, another issue that I've been asked to talk to you about. Does again, this is another one where you've got two sides of the same coin. Does ChatGPT plagiarize? Well, the short answer is no and yes. So as well as it sort of this issue of trust, should I trust it, should I not? It sounds like it's producing things which are novel, but it might not be. It sounds like it's producing things that we should be taking on board and quoting and using, and these are different ideas. There's an issue with ownership of knowledge, which some young people will say, well, I'm not plagiarizing because I generated the commands to put in that produce that piece of information. That information is now mine, and it's written in a way that I probably would have said it, but that's just put it a bit better. It's just rephrased my ideas because I wrote the prompts that created that situation that gave that thing. So we've got a sort of really weird blurred grey area. So what do? Because you've got EPQs, you've got UCAS statements, you've got all these things that kids need to generate stuff. Do they quote? Do they not quote? So ChatGPT does not plagiarize in the sense it doesn't copy information direct from one place, pass it on to you or the student in another. But because it learns from existing sources, some of whom have not given their consent for to be used in the data set, it's going to borrow their ideas and it doesn't give them credit. So yes, it is a form of plagiarism. So the general guidance, and again, this is updated frequently, so go back to whichever exam board or whatever it is that you're looking at in terms of the governing body for the people you're submitting the work for, because they do change these things very frequently at the moment. But generally, you want to be citing it in a similar way to the one that's just on the bottom there where it says reference. So you want to also bear in mind that there's no point in putting the link as if this person's going to access the exact chat, because someone else can't access your own chat. So you could put the link there to say how you've done that. And sort of it was an OpenAI one and it was a chat, but you don't want to be looking at sort of expecting the person to click on the link to be able to use it. So it's as if it's a personal communication that you're citing. So let's see there it says chat. It's a bit like you're sharing an algorithm's output. So you're crediting the author. You might want to put in as the in the in-text thing, it's an OpenAI, but you're not saying that OpenAI have necessarily, you can't go and find that reference somewhere. This is it's a different way of referencing now. Each exam board will have their own specifics around that, so just double check that before you do. So things are rapidly changing. With regards to Turnitin, it can't reliably detect Gen AI contributions, so there'll be too many false positives. It's not really worth worrying about what Turnitin is suggesting about the student's work when it's submitted. You need to develop other ways. You need to look at a different narrative around the thing. Personally, I wouldn't recommend using something that's going to be like threatening in your response to a student's work, that we're going to catch you, you'll be caught out. It's not a narrative that's helpful. It's not a narrative that's going to be useful to your students, because they'll either think they've got one over the system when they do get through, or you start becoming accusatory and belittling their knowledge in some way when you are trying to find out whether they've overused Gen AI to produce work or not. So you need to do something that's slightly different. This is one sort of example of the process of writing that happens when people are using Gen AI tools. And if you look at this, you can see you can't really point to a moment in which plagiarism takes place. You can't really say, oh, yes, it's definitely at the drafting stage or definitely at the reflection stage. It's not really a point at which planning it happened. So if you can wind the model back when you're using Gen AI tools, when you're asking students to write things, and involve Gen AI maybe from the start, so they can start identifying it just as a voice in the room, and then highlight the importance of their own voice in this whole process, of their own understanding in the process, that will make much more sense. If you can elevate the fact that they've got a unique position in the world, that their positionality is really key to what they're trying to say, that will make way more sense. And it's the way that they interpret the things that they are learning, and not just generic words, that will help them articulate their voice, not just give them words to say, which is something that we want to look at as well. But I'll come to the reasons that people generally overuse Gen AI later when I'm talking about the UCL response. But it is just worth bearing in mind that plagiarism is an interesting concept at the moment with regards to Gen AI tools, and it's still very fluid. No one really knows quite what counts, what doesn't count. So I think it's a narrative to step back from and start looking at from a different direction. So one way you can do that is to highlight the inaccuracies that Gen AI can produce. There's different types of inaccuracies. So one of which is lack of representation or stereotyping, which you'll see to the right. There was a BuzzFeed article in which 195 images of Barbie dolls were produced using Midjourney, which you may have heard about or you might hear about later. Every doll that it produced was meant to represent a different country. So there was Afghanistan Barbie, Albania Barbie, Asian Barbies were invariably light-skinned. Philippine Barbie had blonde hair. South Sudan Barbie carried a gun. And there were some really complicated stereotypes that were not nice that were coming out of this tool that was generating these images. So while we should be using them in our teaching, we also need to be aware of these as narratives that are difficult, and also be aware that you don't necessarily want that to come up in a lesson when you are asking students to use them. So that is something, again, that you can look at in terms of when you're getting students to do work, when you're getting students to think about, is it plagiarism? Is it not plagiarism? Should I use this? Should I not? Let's think about, well, what inaccuracies are being put forward. There's also another very famous inaccuracy, which is, it was asked about the world record for crossing the English Channel entirely on foot. Apparently it's 14 hours, 51 minutes. So yeah, it's just produces things that aren't made up. Right, what do you do? Let's look at some practical stuff. So I did a very small pilot at UCL to look at how I can impact on making sure that student voice is elevated, so that they are not just constantly reproducing stuff that they've heard. What I asked students to do is use chatbots to prepare for seminars. And the whole inception of the study was based on this idea that if you use Gen AI more, you err on the side of caution with it more. So I actively encourage them to use these chatbots. I wanted them to have that change relationship with frequent use, becoming less trustful of it. So in short, what I asked them to do is use these, prepare the seminars, come back to me. What I really liked was I sent them off to do that. They very quickly did something else entirely. So rather than going to the chatbot and asking it for questions about the reading, tell me this, tell me that, they flipped it on its head and they got the chatbot to ask them the questions about the reading that they had done. They moved away from the idea where the chatbot was the more knowledgeable other. They put themselves in the position of more knowledgeable other. And they let it then, as I've talked about before, they were able to rehearse their views. They were able to rehearse their phrasing, and they were able to consider their own articulation of what they had learnt from the perspective of another. They took the views of the chatbot as just provisional. They saw it as another voice in the room. When it came up with ideas, they were able to analyse them and think about, well, did I want it to do that or not? So rather than it providing the answers, they had the answers. It identified the gaps. Or they explained things to it and then asked it, what did you understand that I've just said? And if it came back with something that they weren't anticipating, they would then go back and rephrase what they thought they'd said. It didn't cut them off because they'd been too long in their answer, like they had taken too long to think about their response. It gave them the space. It gave them that safe space to articulate who they were. It became a dialogic tool. So what they were is active in their participation. They weren't passive in their consumption. They flipped it on its head. Because in this, they tended to sort of suggest that they over-relied on Gen AI when they either had A, no confidence in their own kind of knowledge to challenge what the Gen AI was telling them, or B, they didn't believe in themselves to think that they knew enough about something to be able to articulate themselves, so they would just take what the Gen AI said. So what we spent time doing then is looking at, well, how can we put you in a position where your voice matters more than its? And they got much more confident about their own voice. They were able to articulate themselves better as a result. And I think people's understanding of the way that Gen AI is best their relationship with Gen AI is a bit this reverse J curve. It's the upside down Nike tick. People love it when they first encounter it, and then they fall out of love with it and realize it doesn't quite meet their needs. So what these students did is just threw that model out altogether. They were like, no, we know this stuff. We've prepared. Tell me now where the gaps in my knowledge are, which is the study partner. These are not new pedagogical tools. It was just how they use the tech. So in conclusion, there's opportunities, there's limitations, there's some really huge concerns, and there's some really massive positives. So I remain really aware, and I really wanted to start this talk off with like, this is sort of how we make it all make sense at the end and a lovely, neat little bow. But I remain acutely aware that I oscillate between these, personally, between these like really positive views, these really intensely negative risks. Whatever tech gives with one hand, it seems to take away with the other. And I think there's this definitely positive use of Gen AI, but I'm always aware of the shadow lurking behind it. And I think if we can take that into schools, that's a much more normal way in which young people can operate within the world. You don't make everything seem hugely exciting by banning it. You don't make everything immediately seem like they should love it as well by presenting it in a way that, wow, we're going to use AI, isn't this fabulous? You use it as a pedagogical tool in just the same way as you would anything else. So there's ethical issues, huge ethical issues around transparency, environmental concerns. There's a digital divide. We've got stereotyping. There's so many aspects where it's problematic. being on this seesaw is exhausting, going, yes, it's great. No, it's not. Yes, it's great. No, it's not. It's exhausting. It's exhausting for me. It's exhausting for young people. But I've also come to realize that it's here, students are using it, it is what it is. And it's the nuanced space that actually provides us with a really rich opportunity to improve our students' criticality, to elevate that argument, to elevate the point of friction that we really need to encourage in education. So while your parents might want to know your approach to Gen AI, or you feel that as a leader in the school, you want to change manage how things operate within your school, you've got to do that with nuance. You can't just decide, right, we're going to be all in this way or all in that way. Because there's no point really. It's like the same as social media. I could sit here and tell you I'm very pro social media, I'm very anti social media, but it doesn't really help anyone. It doesn't really do anything. No one's really that interested in my opinion unless it offers some practical advice. So this is where the practical advice bit comes in. From a society-wide thing, we need law and regulation around it, but we need to know how to prevent further entrenchment of a digital divide, whether that's epistemic, ethical, or economically based. That's the bottom line. But as a school, what you also need is this policies, practical use cases, practical policy. And that's where you need clarity. You need a you can, you shouldn't, you mustn't type of advice for your students, because they need to know what counts as acceptable use and what doesn't within your context. That's up to you to decide as a school. That's your conversation to have. But remember, you need to be open to change and iteration as the landscape evolves, and it will do rapidly. So just because in September you made a policy that says you can, you shouldn't, you mustn't, doesn't mean to say you shouldn't review that again at Christmas. A concrete approach is one way of looking at things. But as I said at the start, there's always two sides of the coin. So a concrete policy, yes, students need to know this is when you can, this is when you must not. But I'm really a big advocate, as I said, of teacher agency. And you've got to respect the professionalism of your staff. And you've got to work on the fact that there's always two sides. There's always a discussion. And you need to see how their expertise fits with that. So ask the people who have the most opposing view to you in their professional opinion, their expertise in learning, not just in technology or not, but in learning, how does that fit or not fit? Give them air, give them space to speak, because what they will offer is often a value system. It's not necessarily going to be tied to the little tech tools that you're worrying about. It will be tied to their value system, and value systems in schools are what makes things move forward. So don't focus on details, don't focus on apps, think about values and broader themes, always have a pedagogical focus. Be open to things looking one way, but maybe they don't have to. Because important aspects of schools are always considered around ethics, always considered around values. And so that's where in the classroom, although I've got strict kind of you can, you must, you shouldn't, I've also got this messy space, which I like in education. I've never been one who's been particularly interested in models of efficiency within education. I don't like nice, neat measurables. I always think that the point of education is to get yourself kind of dirty with the knowledge. Let's get messy in that space. Learning is meant to be friction filled. It shouldn't be made frictionless by everything in like it is the glossy tech space. It needs to be friction filled. It has to be hard earned, because that's when you engage with it. That's when you start caring about what you're learning. So asking questions, being forced to answer them helps you articulate your position. And if you continue to have the difficult conversations around technology, around Gen AI in your school with people who have opposing viewpoints to you, continue those conversations, because it will force you to articulate your value system around the process. And that is what is key. You've got to endeavour to retain student voice. You've got to endeavour to retain staff voice. You can use tech to do that. You need to be aware of the risks. You need to be aware of the positives. But finding your voice is so much more than just having words to say, especially if they've been written by Gen AI. But equally, Gen AI can ask you to find your words, to find your voice. That is all I have to say today. Hopefully we've touched on all of those things. There's so many different aspects of all of this stuff that I'm more than happy to take questions. And I believe we've got a panel discussion at the end as well.
Thank you, Rebecca. There was, yeah, certainly a lot of things to fit into that session, and I think you covered them all brilliantly. And yes, we have quite a lot of questions come in during this session, and also over the course of this morning. I'd like to welcome back Matthew and Philippa, who both presented earlier on. I think we'll start with a question that we had during your session, Matthew, but I think it's one that that all of you will be able to touch on. This came from a teacher in a school. They didn't say exactly where, but they said one of the main battles that we're facing at the moment with AI, but tech sort of more generally in school is input from parents over fears over too much screen time and maybe an over reliance on technology as well. And the person was looking for advice on engaging with parents at that level, and hopefully providing that sort of level of education. Are you able to speak about that a little bit?
Yeah, one of the first things we did is we have the PTA, the connection points, the main touch points for the representation of the parent body. We met with them, we spoke with them, tried to get a feeling of their concerns and fears, and then that built into a series of parental workshops. We run them on phonics and every aspect of the curriculum, but we threw one in about AI this year. It was a split one between EdTech and digital skills in general and having an AI focus, and just explained why we're doing things the way that we're doing it. And my approach has always been the same with children in the class. Usually if people understand why something's happening, they're a lot more relaxed. So if our parents know, like, oh, why is my child coming home and say they talked to a chatbot today in computer science? If we're upfront and say we're doing this for this reason, and it's been carefully thought through, and this is the rationale, and also why we're telling parents that their kids can't buy the Meta Ray-Bans and bring them to school, and why we're also telling teachers, because I thought I wanted to buy a pair, and I was like, actually, if I buy a pair and I'm wearing them at school and I've got 2 cameras trapped to my face, am I breaking GDPR every day or putting myself at a safeguarding risk? So sometimes going down these rabbit holes of thought and actually being upfront with the conversations with students, with staff, and especially parents, especially if you're going to, like, if I can imagine, I know from Philippa's experience as well, if you're going one-to-one iPad, explain why we're going one-to-one iPad or why we're introducing visualizers and things like that. Explaining things is always best.
Philippa, were you going to jump in there?
Yeah, I don't know whether you were going to come back in then. Yeah, no, I totally agree. I think in my experience, the last 8 years, specifically working directly with digital technology, the biggest thing, exactly as Matthew said, is why. I think we sometimes forget that we don't necessarily explain what that is. And with the influx of digital technology, there is a divide between parents and children of the digital natives these days. And actually, when you didn't grow up with it and you haven't had that learned experience of what that looks like in school, all you know it as a tool for work or social play, gaming. And so what we actually need to be doing is explaining a lot more to parents about the fact that, well, actually, when we're in school, we're using it and it's aligned to pedagogy and it's aligned to the reason that we're doing this. We're evaluating, we're using technology for the right purposes, to be creative, to be analytical, and all these problem-solving skills. We're not just throwing them on a game and letting them sit there for an hour while we watch them in a room. And I think it's those different boundaries that we kind of need to be really clear about now, especially as schools start to become more digitalized. They're either allowing devices to be brought in or going one-to-one. I think really interestingly, my son's starting at a school in September, and they don't have a bring your own device model, or so instead of a BYOD, they actually have a mobile learning device. And even the terminology in straight away says to me, okay, they're not just bringing in a device for kind of anything. It's not the one from home. It's not the one they play with. It's learning. And I think that's where we have to really structure it. And just helping support those narratives of, we put these different things in place. This is what we do. This is how we do it. And this is why we do it. And when parents see those things, then they can start to build that into their own experiences and their own understandings of it. And I think the other flip side of that is quite often we get parents, because they see their children on devices at home so frequently, and they're playing and they're scrolling and they're doing things like that, their narrative with it is very different But actually what we then also need to start to support parents to do is build an understanding of what their values and vision are around technology at home, so that then when they're at school, there is a kind of continuation of this ethos that they've brought in and they've built in. And it's not just excess, it's actually very managed and very specific and balanced.
Yeah, absolutely. I think I spoke with a school in Dubai, I think, and we spoke a lot about sort of one-to-one devices and that real importance at that ground level when the students come in the first year, whether that's at age 4 or whether that's at secondary, but having those conversations with parents and sort of leading the conversation there. Dina touched on something in the first session of this morning where she said, students know about AI, they are immersed in it, they are sort of growing up with it. And Rebecca, you sort of touched on that too. So if we're not having to educate students about it, because quite frankly, some of them probably know a little bit more than maybe even some of the teachers, what skills should we be talking with our students about and teaching them to succeed with Gen AI?
Is that to me? Sorry. Yeah. See, I've always gone from a values perspective. I always think it's more important to ask that question first. What values have you got? And then worry about everything else kind of flows. If you've got education as them finding their voice, then that's not really a skill, but them articulating who they are is the most important thing. Them making considered choices about what they're doing, whether that's online or offline. I mean, I don't think there's a distinction now in many young people's minds between the two aspects of their lives. They don't see screen as any different. Their emotional responses are all the same. They're dealing with Gen AI as people or not people. I think if you go from a values perspective, you don't even particularly need to have the conversation about skills, because criticality flows from values. Criticality flows from listening to and understanding the views of others. Having empathy flows towards appreciating other people's viewpoints. So yeah, I mean, parents get quite caught up with skills and they want to know that you've got this skill or that skill, but I think a values question is always worth having first. Values conversation, what values are they expecting? What values have they signed up to as well from your school? Like, they've obviously gone for your school for a reason. There must be a value system embedded within that context that they already approve of. So how can you connect that to what they're expecting from you?
Yeah, no, that's a really good point. Sort of like you say, attack or linking it with the value system of schools. I think a lot of schools talk about the values and are very good at sort of putting that to the forefront. But I think there's a challenge there with tying that in with tech and AI and especially how that's used. We had a question earlier on about PD, about professional development. I think Matthew, you touched on it slightly. This came from a school leader, and they said they have the staffing body has a wide variation in tech sort of use and experience of AI, and they're looking for some tips or help on kind of where to start with that. Like, where are we coming at this from? Do we go at the ground level? Do we pitch it somewhere in between? How do we cope with that?
The best thing to do, in the way I've done it, is just workshops, because it's the best way is to get people in a room, and we run them in the IT labs. But people come in and say, we're going to run one focused on differentiation for send. We're going to run one focused on using AI images, and it's a very focused workshop. But obviously, if a teacher comes in and they want to focus on a certain thing, we go off in that direction. But the main thing is, as I've learned, is just going over the concepts. Like, this is how you can generate an image. This is how you can generate a lesson or generate something with AI. The best thing to do is go, okay, before you leave, work on something with AI that you're going to do after you left this training session. So they actually walk away with an application. And it's the same as we do for a student. We teach them something, we give them some knowledge, and then we ask them to apply it before they leave the lesson. So what I found at the beginning, I was giving them some knowledge. Here's how you prompt, here's how you do something. And then it was, bye, we'll see you at the next workshop. Then I quickly learned application was key, because we always forget as teachers to do training sessions with staff as we would with students. We always forget the application part. So it's really key.
Thanks, Matthew. Philippa, do you want to come in there?
I think Rebecca was first, but I just she had her hand up with being very teacher-like. Yeah, I was just going to say in the same way. So interestingly, actually, the report that's just going to come out in a couple of weeks has got some really nice information about how other schools have been doing it globally. But I think in a similar way to the way Matthew's been doing it, what I've been finding recently is people, as much as we all say, oh, we can learn online, we can do it ourselves, we can self-pace, we don't, because we have so much to do as educators, that actually getting people into that room to be able to do those things is really important. And I think one of the things that I've been trying to do with schools as well is to give people the option so that they can almost, in the same way we would in a classroom, is you scaffold what you're doing. So if you know the basics, then you go to this one. If you don't, then you go to this one. And again, as Matthew alluded to just then as well, for me, it's never the tech, it's the learning. Okay, right, so what are we trying to achieve within the classroom? What's the overall goal? How are we doing that in terms of pedagogy? What do we want to achieve? Okay, well, these are some tools that could help. Sometimes they might not be technology, but if we blend them in with what we're already doing, then we start to enhance those skills. Some people will automatically delve deeper into that, and others will do whatever they can to understand that level, and then they'll feel confident when they come back in and do the next step for that. But I think it's really important to always bring it back to why our teachers are initially there, because a lot of teachers, especially who are still in education now, they didn't come into it with tech there. So this is very difficult for people to get into that kind of mindset that it's just part and parcel of our children's lives now and our lives. And actually, so building it into what we're doing pedagogically is really, really important. And I think the other thing as well is just knowing that there's always someone, I always used to say my door is always open. Like, people would come to me all the time, and it'd just be it could be a quick question, it could be a deeper dive. And for those people where it is a deeper dive, that's where you start to do research projects, you do action research, you do things that lead into a spark, something that's going to give them somewhere to share that, to maybe inspire other people. And so it really, we need to look at professional learning now as very personalized, very individual, regardless of the size of the school.
Yeah, just following on from Philippa's comment there, I think you need to always convince people why would they do this? Like, why do they need it or not need it? Never presume they would need it, because often teachers are spoken to as if there is a deficit in what they're doing, that somehow what they're doing isn't good enough, and they need this next new thing that will definitely make them good or better, maybe not good enough, but better. And I think respecting that professionalism, or what you're doing is definitely good enough, but you might want to think about this, or you might not, but here it is anyway, and you make your choice. You've got agency, you've got professionalism. I'm just going to introduce it to you as a concept. The why is always a starting point, and then go from how. So yeah, cool.
You've got your hand up as well.
Yeah, when we're just talking, it reminded me when we were running a CPD for staff on group work. We made the head of science, actually, who was running the session, made a chatbot who became a member of the group with the staff. So they could start to interact with it and say, oh, this is how you could potentially use it in a lesson, because I'm interacting it with as a fifth member of our team. So that was quite a nice example of taking them through an example of a learning process with AI that they could then potentially bring into the classroom. So it's usually use cases and examples, and time is the main thing.
Brilliant. Thanks, everyone. The next question I have, which I think everyone sort of touched on in various ways, is to do with AI and assessment. Matthew, you shared that graph, I think, earlier on, that said it was likely to be one of the least uses of AI. Rebecca, I think you said that was one of the original fears, that AI would replace assessment. What do you think? What does the future hold for assessment? Is it the end of formal examinations? What impact do we think that AI may or may not have on exams? That's to anyone.
Who wants to go first? I would say, I realised that I didn't necessarily touch upon it. I think for me, AI for our SEND learners is really important, but not necessarily AI accessibility features and tools. I think we need to get to the point where those are the norms. So regardless of how many devices your schools have or anything like that, teachers and students to be empowered to understand how their devices can help them to be able to get to the next level and prosper, whether that's in an examination or not, are really important, because they're the tools they are going to be living with for the rest of their lives, and they're going to get better to help them, support them. I think the question of whether AI is going to get rid of formal examinations, I would hope it's not AI that's the reason. I would hope they just go because they're just not relevant in a lot of contexts. And I think the way in which we do some of those exams now is just not fit for purpose for our real life. If we look at what's happening in the real world, you know, I could sit here and tell you my GCSEs and A-level results, but have they had an impact on my future and what I've actually become? Absolutely not. So
Matthew or Rebecca, do you have anything to add on AI and assessment?
From a more cynical perspective, I'm aware of how much exam companies are investing in AI marking. So do they want the exams to go? Because they've spent an awful lot of money working out how they can use AI to mark human written exam papers. However, maybe you'll end up with a loop being closed with AI marking AI scripts and just cut out the middleman.
Yeah.
I think for me, like, exams generally, I agree with Philippa, like they're not particularly fit for purpose. If there's a way that you could take what Rebecca's just said about AI playing a role in marking, and that allowed students to express their learning in many different ways, and there was some kind of summative assessment of that could be built in, where it could be better at marking 18 different assignments. One's a podcast, one's a infographic, maybe something like that. But for me, the most powerful use case of AI right now for assessment is the interim feedback. Like, for example, that example I showed with the chatbot, that just, I don't like the phrase like the 10 times teacher thing, but that just took like a routine task that I would have a student waiting 10 minutes to get feedback from me, and they were allowed to have immediate feedback. That for me is where you could take some of the, because in a lesson, I calculated once my students get 30 seconds of time with me once I've started the class. So if I can get more time with my students or allow them to make more progress or achieve more within the time I have with them, then that's, I think, where it can have a massive impact. But yeah, assessments, like, bye-bye.
Thank you, everyone. I think I've got time to squeeze in one more question, and this is from a teacher who is incredibly interested in AI. They're a real, they want to be a real advocate for it, but they're facing difficulties with sort of middle and senior leadership at school who are just sort of essentially shutting it down at the cause. How would you sort of empower someone to keep being that advocate for AI? Who's going to unmute first? Rebecca's gone first.
I don't want to jump in. I just, I first of all, I really hear that frustration. Yeah, it's really hard to be the person who also comes across as a slight kind of tech evangelist, and you're like trying to sort of really push this tech agenda the whole time, and then they only ever see you as the tech person.
Sure.
And then everything you do just, oh, she's talking about tech again. It's worth appealing to that, the value system thing again. I'd say, like, what is it you're trying to achieve here? Let's take the tech out of the conversation, and then you've got an actual educational values, like what shared values have we got about education, and then where can we go from there, rather than just trying to approach it from a tech perspective. Some people will never have their minds changed. They've got an agenda that's very different, and you might not ever convince them, unfortunately. But if you've got stronger educational narratives that you can come back with that aren't tech-based, then those arguments may appeal to them, because you're not talking about tech anymore, you're talking about education.
Yeah.
Yeah, I totally agree with Rebecca. I think going through that narrative, an easier way in as well, especially now things are becoming more consolidated and a little bit easier to navigate. I mean, at one point there was just an explosion, wasn't there, of all these different things. We're now seeing the big ed tech companies coming out with their own AI and how it works and everything else. So my initial thing to say to people would be, go stay close to home. Because if you've got people in your senior and middle leadership who are reluctant and who don't want to be kind of diving into that, if you can use things that are in your own ecosystem already, for instance, if you're in the Microsoft ecosystem, start to look at those tools, start to eke those in, because you know that there's policies and things behind them. You know that there's safeguards and rails in there for students in learning within that learning environment, because it's for students. So you can start to build on that. And then, being someone who's written about 7 million policies, I would just say, just guidance again, of just kind of not really strict, you know, nothing kind of, you must do this and then do this. It's very clear. Just we are making sure we're being ethical, we're using it for the right reasons, doing it to drive pedagogy, we're doing it for, you know, things that are just going to build more positivity into it, but allow some people to feel they've got that kind of safety net, and then start to explore out of that. Because if you're showing them that it's in tools already, I mean, if you said to them, well, it's in everything you use on your computer anyway, so already you've broken down a barrier. And if you just slowly do things like that, it becomes more normalized as well, because eventually it will, that people won't even think about it. We'll fall off the edge of the hype and it'll just be what we do.
Yeah, and like you mentioned with the accessibility tools, you know, so many of those just being there that a lot of people just aren't aware of, or perhaps are, like, they're aware of them but not what they are and what they're for.
Absolutely.
So for me, like, I went back in last August, and I think everyone thought I was a crazy person because I came back as like, AI's here, this is going to happen, but like all the stuff about operating systems being in phones, like I think all those things happening for me has allowed me to do more stuff with students and staff. I think it's just been a phased approach of people at first going, AI, oh, it'll blow over, it'll disappear, to it now people seeing it's becoming more and more embedded in everyday life, everyday devices. So I think approaching it like everything we do in PSHE, like we talk to kids about things that are going to happen in the real world. So why wouldn't we talk about something which is going to impact their lives? And if it helps, I sat down with the school director and the school owner and talked to them about their pinch points, and then tried to show them how ChatGPT could help them. And if you can show them how it can help them write emails to staff, or help them write a little business action plan, or give them an example and let them see the value. And for me, like, I've spoke about student usage, but that came very late. 99.9% of it was showing staff how to use it to differentiate, to plan worksheets, to actually get some time back. Coming up with questions is very time consuming all the time. So you can speed up that kind of routine process of coming up with 10 good Bloom's taxonomy questions. Start there, show the value for staff, and keep trying. I plugged away. It's like, it may look very glamorous, like I've achieved a lot, but it's been a lot of pushing and going back and saying, like, this is why I see it. And what Rebecca said, our values are this. Like, are we preparing students as 21st century learners if we're not discussing it in any way?
Yeah, absolutely. Philippa.
I'm just going to plug the white paper one more time, because it's got some really great examples of how to embed it really slowly or really fast. So I just thought I'd shout out there again, because there are some really great things happening in schools globally, and it was really interesting to see the different approaches from everybody. So I think there's something in there for a range of different people in schools.
Brilliant. Thank you very much, everyone. I think we'll leave it there for today. That concludes day one of our annual conference. Thank you very much to Matthew, to Philippa, to Rebecca, to Dina, who joined us this morning, and to Lee and Sammy, who kicked us off. As Philippa mentioned, if you are interested in learning more about AI, we have the AI report, which is coming out very, very soon, available to pre-order on our website. And tomorrow is our second and final day of the conference. There'll be more of a focus on the data and the intelligence of the international schools market. That will include our global market overview session and the key country growth sessions from our field research team. So if you aren't signed up already, make sure you're RSVP in the ISC community. But once again, a big thank you to everybody, and have a great rest of your day. Cheers. Bye-bye.